Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we delve into the chilling case of the Green River Killer, one of America's most infamous serial murderers. Using publicly available research, we'll explore the harrowing details of Gary Ridgway's crimes, the extensive investigation that sought to bring him to justice, and the lasting impact on the victims' families and the community. What drove Ridgway to commit such unspeakable acts? Join us as we piece together this haunting story, uncovering the facts and insights surrounding a case that still sends shivers down our spines. The Green River Killer, a true crime story. Once upon a time, in the lush, green landscapes of Washington state, a shadow loomed over the city of Seattle. In the early 1980s, a series of disappearances began to shake the community, igniting fear and uncertainty. Women, often marginalized and vulnerable, began vanishing without a trace. The area near the Green River would become synonymous with horror, marking the beginning of a chilling chapter in true crime history, the beginning of darkness. In the early 1980s, the vibrant city of Seattle was known for its stunning natural beauty, cultural diversity, and burgeoning music scene. Yet, beneath this picturesque facade, a grim reality began to unfold, a series of disappearances that would change the community forever. The first disappearances. The first victim to go missing was Wendy Lee Caulfield, a 16-year-old girl who had dreams of a better life. On March 7, 1982, Wendy left her home in the Seattle area, intending to meet friends but never arrived. Her family reported her missing, but like many cases that followed, the urgency faded as days turned into weeks and hope began to dwindle. Shortly after Wendy's disappearance, another young woman, 19-year-old Annie Hensley, vanished without a trace. Like Wendy, Annie was vulnerable, navigating a world filled with challenges. The community began to take notice, but the fear of what was happening remained largely unspoken. The disappearances of these young women were not isolated incidents, but rather the beginning of a terrifying trend. The police were initially reluctant to connect the cases, believing that many of the missing were simply runaways or involved in risky lifestyles. This mindset contributed to a lack of urgency in the early stages of the investigation. The rising tide of fear. As the months passed, the disappearances continued. By 1983, the police had confirmed several additional cases of missing women, each echoing the tragic pattern established by Wendy and Annie. Many of the victims were known to be involved in sex work, struggling with addiction, or experiencing homelessness. These factors contributed to a chilling sense of vulnerability, making them prime targets for a predator. The community began to grapple with an unsettling reality. A killer was lurking in their midst. The media caught wind of the rising number of missing persons, and headlines began to emerge, drawing public attention. Families of the missing women rallied for justice, organizing search parties and vigils in hopes of shining a light on the plight of their loved ones. Community leaders urged law enforcement to take the situation seriously, emphasizing the need for a dedicated task force. However, initial responses were hampered by systemic biases that overlooked the lives of marginalized women. Many in law enforcement believed that the victims were simply asking for trouble by living risky lifestyles. The victims' stories. Each victim represented a life filled with potential and promise, tragically cut short. Women like Cynthia Hines, a 29-year-old mother of two, were living through difficult times but still held on to dreams for the future. Cynthia disappeared in 1983, and her family was left devastated, desperately seeking answers. Other victims included Maureen Emote Dwyer, who had dreams of becoming a model and escape from her troubled past, and Vicky Lynn Aiton, a young woman with a gentle spirit who was well loved by her friends and family. These women were more than just names on a list. They were individuals with dreams, struggles, and stories that would never be fully told. The growing number of disappearances began to create a palpable sense of fear in the community. Parents warned their daughters to be cautious, friends looked out for one another, and the streets that were once familiar and safe now felt like a lurking danger. The first body. In July 1982, the first significant breakthrough in the case occurred when the body of a young woman was discovered in the Green River, near the city of Kent. The remains were identified as those of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield, the first reported missing victim. Her family's heartache transformed into anguish as they learned the truth. Wendy would never come home. The discovery marked a turning point. The realization that a murderer was operating in their midst sent shockwaves through the community. Fear intensified, but so did the urgency for answers. With each new victim found, the case drew more attention. Local news outlets began to cover the story extensively, showcasing the family's grief and the community's growing frustration with law enforcement's perceived indifference. This media spotlight brought a sense of urgency to the investigation as public pressure mounted for authorities to take action. A growing task force. In response to the mounting fear and media attention, the King County Sheriff's Office officially formed a task force in 1983 dedicated to investigating the string of disappearances. Detectives began pooling resources and expertise, hoping to connect the dots between the cases. Despite these efforts, the investigation faced significant challenges. The victims were often marginalized individuals, and their disappearances were not always treated with the seriousness they warranted. The detectives struggled to find witnesses, as many people in the areas frequented by the victims were reluctant to speak to law enforcement. The task force's efforts were compounded by the complexity of the cases. Each victim's story was unique, yet they all shared the common thread of vulnerability. The detectives faced the daunting task of piecing together a narrative from the fragments left behind. Community resilience. Despite the challenges, the families of the victims refused to remain silent. They organized vigils, holding candles in memory of their lost loved ones, and they distributed flyers with photos of the missing women. Community leaders began to raise awareness about the issue, pushing for a more comprehensive approach to address the disappearances. As fear spread, so did resilience. Community members came together to support one another, sharing resources and information. They created forums to discuss the ongoing crisis, advocating for more comprehensive policing and greater protections for vulnerable individuals. The growing sense of solidarity highlighted the strength of the community. The stories of the victims became a rallying cry for change, urging those in power to listen to the voices of the families who had been left behind. The investigation, a complex web. The investigation into the Green River Killer became one of the most extensive and complicated manhunts in American history. As the bodies began to pile up, the urgency to apprehend the killer grew exponentially. Law enforcement faced numerous challenges, including limited resources, the transient nature of many victims, and the vast geographic area they had to cover. The initial task force. In 1982, after the first few women went missing, the King County Sheriff's Office formed a task force dedicated to solving the case. Detectives pored over missing person reports, piecing together a timeline of the victims' disappearances. Each victim's story was a puzzle piece, and the detectives were desperate to find the edges to complete the picture. Detectives utilized traditional investigative techniques, such as interviews and surveillance. They canvassed neighborhoods where the women were last seen, speaking to friends, family, and anyone who might have relevant information. But leads often went cold. The police struggled to find witnesses willing to come forward, particularly in areas where many women engaged in sex work, fearing legal repercussions or harassment. Patterns and profiles. As more bodies were discovered, investigators noticed a disturbing pattern. The victims shared similar characteristics. Many were young, vulnerable women who had fallen into a cycle of addiction or were involved in sex work. Some were runaways or had unstable home lives. This led detectives to believe that the killer was specifically targeting women on the fringes of society. However, establishing a psychological profile of the killer proved challenging. The detectives gathered insights from criminologists and psychologists, aiming to understand the mind of a serial killer. They theorized that the killer might be someone who felt empowered by taking control of vulnerable lives, a theory that would later prove chillingly accurate. Early suspects. Early in the investigation, several suspects were briefly considered but ultimately cleared. The task force examined individuals with criminal records and those who lived or worked near the areas where the bodies were found. One notable suspect was a man named Paul John Knowles, a serial killer active during the same period. However, he was ultimately ruled out, leading detectives back to square one. Frustration grew as the investigation seemed to stall. With no clear suspect and the community growing increasingly fearful, pressure mounted on law enforcement to deliver results. Community meetings were held, and families of victims pleaded for help, desperate for answers. The role of the media coverage of the case was intense, with local news stations regularly reporting on the latest developments. The disappearances of these women sparked public outcry, and the community rallied around the victims' families, demanding justice. As public interest swelled, detectives found themselves caught between the demands for progress and the reality of the investigation. Some critics argued that the police were not doing enough, especially since many victims came from marginalized backgrounds. In response, the task force ramped up their efforts, conducting more interviews and reaching out to the public for tips. Technological challenges. In the early 1980s, forensic science was still in its infancy. Many of the bodies recovered were in advanced stages of decomposition, complicating forensic analysis. Investigators often relied on rudimentary techniques for identifying victims, such as dental records or personal effects found with the bodies. As time passed, detectives began to explore the potential of emerging forensic technologies. However, they were often hampered by budget constraints and a lack of advanced equipment. The forensic capabilities of the time did not match the complexity of the case, leading to missed opportunities for linking evidence to Ridgway. Breakthrough: DNA technology. It wasn't until the late 1990s and early 2000s that advances in DNA technology provided a crucial breakthrough. By then, the case had grown cold, but investigators were not ready to give up. In 2001, the King County Sheriff's Office decided to revisit old evidence using new DNA testing methods. The decision to reanalyze existing evidence was monumental. Forensic scientists combed through biological samples collected from crime scenes, searching for DNA profiles that could link the murders to a specific suspect. It was a painstaking process that took time, but the team was determined to utilize every available resource. The culmination of this effort came when DNA evidence linked Ridgway to several of the victims. This evidence provided a solid lead, marking a turning point in the case that had eluded resolution for nearly 2 decades. Surveillance and arrest. Once Ridgway was identified as a suspect, investigators began to monitor his activities closely. They placed him under surveillance, collecting evidence to build a case against him. During this time, law enforcement discovered disturbing patterns in Ridgway's behavior. He frequently visited areas known for sex work and had connections to many of the victims. Investigators began to piece together his daily routine, documenting his movements and interactions. They knew they were close but needed concrete evidence to secure an arrest. On November 30, 2001, Ridgway was taken into custody. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. This seemingly normal man was the monster they had been hunting for years. As news broke, many were left grappling with disbelief. How could someone so ordinary have committed such heinous acts? The aftermath of the investigation. The arrest of Gary Ridgway marked the beginning of a new chapter in the investigation. It opened up discussions about the treatment of vulnerable women, societal attitudes towards sex work, and the systemic failures that allowed such a predator to thrive for so long. In the wake of his capture, detectives continued to examine the evidence, hoping to close more cases. They began to investigate whether Ridgway was responsible for additional murders that had gone unsolved. His confession ultimately revealed a staggering truth. He admitted to killing 71 women, a number that left the community reeling. The investigation had begun as a quest for justice for a handful of victims, but evolved into an exploration of a chilling truth about the nature of violence against women. Law enforcement, advocacy groups, and the community began to collaborate, aiming to ensure that no one else would be overlooked or forgotten. The confession, a chilling admission. The confession of Gary Ridgway, the man who would be known as the Green River Killer, is one of the most haunting elements of this tragic case. After years of investigation and mounting evidence, his admission of guilt would ultimately provide some closure for the families of his victims, but also reveal the depths of his depravity. The arrest and initial interrogation. Gary Ridgway was arrested on November 30, 2001, after DNA evidence linked him to several of the Green River murders. At the time, Ridgway was a seemingly unremarkable man, a truck painter by trade, a husband, and a father living in the suburbs of Seattle. The contrast between his everyday life and the horrific crimes he committed was shocking. During the initial interrogation, Ridgway appeared calm and composed, a demeanor that belied the gravity of the situation. Detectives were eager to elicit a confession, but Ridgway was initially evasive, providing vague answers and attempting to minimize his involvement. However, the detectives were prepared, armed with compelling evidence, including DNA samples and circumstantial evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. The tension in the interrogation room was palpable as investigators pressed him for details, laying out the evidence they had against him. They were determined to get a confession, knowing that it would provide critical closure for the families and solidify their case. The turning point. After several hours of questioning, the atmosphere began to shift. Detectives skillfully introduced the notion of cooperation, suggesting that a confession could lead to a lighter sentence. They emphasized the importance of the victims' families and how their answers could provide closure. Ridgway, realizing that the evidence was overwhelming, began to relent. At this pivotal moment, Ridgway's demeanor changed. He began to share fragments of his story, slowly piecing together a narrative that was as chilling as it was shocking. What followed was a detailed account of his actions, his method of luring women, the circumstances of their deaths, and the horrific aftermath. The graphic details. Ridgway's confession was laden with graphic details, revealing not only the coldness of his actions, but also the disturbing psychology behind them. He spoke of how he would approach vulnerable women, many of whom were involved in sex work, promising them money or companionship. He would lure them to secluded areas, often under the pretense of taking them to a safe place, only to turn on them once they were isolated. In chilling detail, Ridgway recounted the acts he committed, often expressing a chilling lack of remorse. He admitted to killing 71 women, a staggering number that shocked both investigators and the public. His method often involved strangulation, which he described with an unsettling sense of detachment. He spoke of the thrill he derived from exerting control over his victims, a revelation that sent shivers through the room. Ridgway also recounted revisiting the bodies after the murders, a gruesome ritual that highlighted his complete lack of empathy. He described how he would sometimes return to the crime scenes, even engaging in sexual acts with the bodies, further emphasizing the depths of his depravity. The motives behind the madness. As investigators probed deeper, they sought to understand the motives behind Ridgway's actions. He admitted to struggling with feelings of inadequacy and a desire to exert power over women, viewing them as objects rather than individuals. This chilling perspective painted a portrait of a man deeply troubled and disconnected from humanity, driven by a need to dominate and control. Ridgway's confessions revealed a disturbing interplay between his personal life and his crimes. He had a tumultuous marriage marked by infidelity, and he often projected his frustrations onto his victims. He described a growing anger toward women, stemming from his belief that they had wronged him, which drove him to commit the unthinkable acts of violence. A disturbing admission. In the days following his arrest, Ridgway continued to cooperate with law enforcement, offering insights into his methodology and revealing details about the locations where he had dumped the bodies. He often referred to the women by their names, which shocked investigators who had grown accustomed to viewing them as mere statistics in a series of tragic cases. Ridgway's willingness to cooperate contrasted sharply with the chilling nature of his crimes. He would point out the areas along the Green River where he had disposed of bodies, describing how he would hide them among the trees or in remote locations, hoping to evade detection. The impact on victims' families. When the families of the victims learned of Ridgway's confession, it was a double-edged sword. While they longed for answers and closure, the graphic nature of his admissions was difficult to bear. Many families attended the trial and heard the harrowing details firsthand, reliving their grief with each revelation. The public outcry surrounding Ridgway's confession amplified the call for justice and brought renewed attention to the lives of the women he had killed. Advocacy groups began to rally around the victims' stories, pushing for systemic changes in how society treated vulnerable individuals and how law enforcement responded to missing persons cases. Plea deal and sentencing. Ultimately, Ridgway's confession played a crucial role in the plea deal he accepted. In 2003, he pled guilty to 49 counts of murder, receiving a sentence of 70 years without the possibility of parole. The deal was struck partly to provide closure for the families of the victims and to ensure that he would never walk free again. Ridgway's confession would go down in history as one of the most disturbing admissions in the annals of true crime. It not only shed light on the psyche of a serial killer, but also highlighted the urgent need for societal change regarding how we view and treat marginalized populations. The verdict and sentencing. A moment of justice and reflection. The trial of Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer, unfolded in 2003, capturing national attention and evoking deep emotions among the families of his victims, the local community, and the nation at large. This phase marked a critical juncture in the long saga of the Green River murders, a culmination of years of grief, fear, and relentless pursuit of justice. The trial begins. The trial began in February 2003, but it was not a typical courtroom drama. Instead, it unfolded as a harrowing recounting of brutal crimes against vulnerable women. Ridgway had already pled guilty to 49 counts of murder as part of a plea deal, which significantly shaped the proceedings. His admission of guilt was a pivotal moment, providing some level of closure to the families, but also raising numerous questions about the nature of his crimes and the systemic issues that allowed him to evade capture for so long. The court proceedings were heavily focused on Ridgway's confessions and the impact of his actions on the victims' families. Each day, the courtroom was filled with relatives of the victims, many of whom wore buttons with the photographs of their loved ones, a poignant reminder of the lives lost. Their presence underscored the human cost of Ridgway's actions and added an emotional weight to the proceedings. The emotional testimonies. One of the most powerful aspects of the trial was the opportunity for victims' families to provide impact statements. These heartfelt testimonies offered a platform for them to express their grief, anger, and longing for justice. Family members took the stand to share their memories, detailing the lives and aspirations of their loved ones before they fell victim to Ridgway's violence. These statements became a cathartic moment for the families, allowing them to confront the man who had caused them unimaginable pain. Many spoke about the void left in their lives, the birthdays and holidays forever altered, and the enduring trauma of losing someone they loved. Some family members expressed feelings of rage toward Ridgway, while others sought to convey forgiveness, emphasizing their desire for healing over hatred. These diverse responses showcased the complexities of grief and highlighted the profound impact of Ridgway's actions on the lives of those he affected. The prosecution and defense. The prosecution aimed to paint a comprehensive picture of Ridgway as a methodical killer who exploited the vulnerabilities of women. They presented evidence of his extensive history of violence and manipulation, including details of how he would lure his victims with false promises before committing his heinous acts. Expert witnesses were called to testify about the psychological profile of a serial killer, further illuminating Ridgway's mindset and motivations. The prosecution sought to establish that Ridgway viewed his victims not as people but as objects to satisfy his urges. In contrast, the defense sought to mitigate the impact of Ridgway's actions. They argued for understanding and context, emphasizing his troubled upbringing and the complexities of his mental state. However, this approach was met with skepticism, especially given the overwhelming evidence of Ridgway's actions and the profound suffering he had caused. The verdict. On February 22, 2003, after just a few days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The announcement sent ripples through the courtroom, met with tears and silent prayers from the families present. For many, the verdict represented a long-awaited acknowledgement of the pain and suffering endured over decades. The verdict was a bittersweet victory for the families of the victims. While it provided a sense of justice, it could never erase the losses they had experienced. The families stood united, many embracing one another in a moment of shared relief, knowing that their loved ones had finally received recognition. Sentencing. The weight of justice. Following the verdict, the court moved to the sentencing phase, where the focus shifted to the appropriate punishment for Ridgway's unimaginable crimes. As part of his plea agreement, Ridgway faced a sentence of 70 years without the possibility of parole, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for a serial killer. On March 4, 2003, the sentencing took place. The courtroom was filled with the families of victims, journalists, and community members, all eager to witness the conclusion of a case that had consumed them for years. The atmosphere was heavy with emotion as the judge prepared to impose the sentence. When the judge read the sentence, A wave of relief washed over the families, yet the weight of grief remained palpable. Ridgway would spend the rest of his life behind bars, ensuring he could never harm another person. The judge expressed condolences to the victims' families, acknowledging the profound loss and pain they had endured. Aftermath and legacy. The fallout from the Green River Killer case was profound. It forced a reckoning within the community and highlighted the need for better support systems for vulnerable populations, particularly women involved in sex work. The lives of the victims were finally being honored, their stories brought to light after years of being overshadowed. Yet, even in the aftermath, the case highlighted critical issues about society's treatment of marginalized populations. Advocates and community leaders began to push for changes in how law enforcement interacted with these communities, ensuring that no one else would fall through the cracks. In the years that followed, Seattle engaged in deep self-reflection. Memorials were erected for the victims, and community organizations emerged, dedicated to supporting at-risk individuals and advocating for policy changes to prevent such tragedies from happening again. The story of the Green River Killer and the subsequent trial of Gary Ridgway is a harrowing tale that intertwines tragedy, loss, and the pursuit of justice. The heinous actions of Ridgway, which resulted in the deaths of dozens of vulnerable women, not only shattered countless lives but also exposed significant flaws within societal structures that allowed such violence to persist unchecked for so long. The verdict and sentencing provided a moment of closure for the families of the victims, acknowledging their pain and honoring the lives that were tragically cut short. Yet, this closure was bittersweet, underscored by the enduring grief and the realization that no verdict could fully restore what was lost. The aftermath of Ridgway's capture catalyzed important conversations around the treatment of marginalized individuals, particularly women involved in sex work or facing addiction. It inspired advocacy efforts aimed at reforming policies to ensure better protection and support for those at risk, highlighting the need for empathy and understanding in addressing systemic issues of violence. Ultimately, the legacy of the Green River Killer transcends the individual horror of Ridgway's crimes. It serves as a poignant reminder of the importance of vigilance, community awareness, and the need to uplift the voices of the most vulnerable among us. The case galvanized a movement for change, urging society to confront uncomfortable truths and strive for a future where every life is valued and no victim is forgotten. As we reflect on this dark chapter, let it inspire a commitment to compassion, justice, and an unwavering dedication to preventing such tragedies from occurring in the future. The stories of the victims, once silenced, now resonate as powerful calls for change, urging us to advocate for a safer, more just society for all. Thank you for joining us on this unsettling journey into the life and crimes of the Green River Killer. While justice was eventually served, the scars left on the victims' families and the community remain. It's a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What are your reflections on this case? Until next time, stay vigilant and take care.